The forest was tight as a fist, wet leaves pressed to helmets and rifles while fog hung between the firs. A platoon moved uphill in a staggered line, backs bent, boots sucking in mud, each man counting the last few cigarettes in his pocket like rations. Artillery thumped somewhere behind them, soft at first, and then close enough to rattle the webbing on their shoulders. When the shells stopped, the only sound was wind sliding through the trees and a word that ran down the file. Forward. They were Americans with last names that sounded like the Pacific, faces their enemy said could be picked out at a glance. Someone had painted their motto on a crate back at the trailhead, "Go for broke." Ahead, a Texas battalion was cut off on a ridge, with its radio fading in and out, short bursts of code and pleading. The map said impassable slopes. The battalion commander said, "Find a way." They climbed where trails gave up, picked steps among roots slick enough to roll an ankle, and worked past wire strung low in the brush. Fire reached for them from 3 sides. They kept moving because stopping gave the ground to someone else. The regiment had begun far from these trees, under a southern sun that stuck to the inside of the mouth. They drilled until blisters went smooth. They learned to live with suspicion dressed as courtesy, visiting brass who praised them and reminded them they had a lot to prove, cooks who saved the better bread until a white unit passed through, a gate guard who looked too long at every pass. Letters from home came through censors with strips missing and sentences bitten clean. Some envelopes carried return addresses from desert towns bounded by fence and guard towers. Mothers wrote about dust, fathers about jobs given up overnight, sisters about lines for supper. The men folded those letters twice and put them in the same pocket every time. Word of combat filtered back from men who wore the same patch with a different number. The 100th, bruised and grinning, who had clawed up the Italian peninsula one hill at a time. When the regiment shipped out and linked with the 100th, the old hands called them kids until the first time the line buckled and the kids held. Names mattered less than the steady way companies fit together. They learned the smell of a burned vineyard and the sound a farmhouse makes when a tank rips a corner off. They learned that a shout in Japanese or in Kansas English sounds like the same thing when it's fear or direction. They carried more than rifles. They carried proof. Every advance, every line held, every wound taped and ignored, pushed back against a sign that had once hung over the West Coast reading enemy ancestry. They knew the country's test questions even if they never signed the papers. Will you swear loyalty to a nation that doubts you? Will you serve while your family wakes to a bugle that isn't yours? Will you prove a negative in blood? Answers came across fields with poor cover and along rock terraces that offered none. Italy taught patience. Towns sat on crests like fists, and you pried them open with days of artillery and rain that turned to sleet. The enemy hid guns in ravines and farm lanes and waited for you to bunch up. You learned not to bunch up. Once, on a river crossing, a sergeant joked he'd left his good shoes in Los Angeles, and a mortar answered from the far bank. The joke survived, and the sergeant did too, which made it worth telling later. By the time the regiment turned north and mountains stacked up again, the men who had started as strangers now moved with the reflex of family. Their patch felt heavier not from cloth, but from what people were beginning to say about it. They hauled machine guns across slopes that ought to have needed rope and pushed into towns where shutters opened a finger width to Americans whose faces did not match the posters. The fog-bound Vosges gave no gifts. Trails turned into gullies full of cold water, maps lied by omission, and radio batteries died without ceremony. The enemy was dug in behind wire and interlocking fire and knew you'd have to come straight at him. The first attack slammed into machine guns that raked the slope from 3 directions. Men hit the ground and clawed into thin soil with helmets and bare hands. A squad leader called for smoke and got white confusion that hid nothing for long. Medics crawled where the angle of the hill and the burst of a shell allowed a space the size of a man. No one wrote poetry that night. They ate cold rations that tasted like they had been stored in a car trunk and passed canteens in short, guilty pulls. The chaplain moved among them like any other man with work to do, pressing a hand to a shoulder. When the attack started again, 2 companies shifted wide to climb a slope the book said could not be climbed. They found grip in roots and seams of rock. When the machine guns found them again, they kept coming, close enough to throw grenades by feel. Grenadiers counted the seconds against their cheekbones and let go. In the end, the fight broke not with a shout, but with exhaustion changing sides. A little band of Texans appeared down the slope, gaunt and bearded, blinking against daylight. Someone laughed the way people laugh when they realize they will get another day. The Texans tried to shake every hand, and the rescuers tried to count their own, and failed because the roll of living and missing caught in the throat. The tally for that push could be read later in hospital rolls and on headstones, but in the moment, it lived in the way men walked back down the hill, some stumbling, some supporting a friend by the web strap of his helmet, all moving as if the mountain owed them a path now. The war did not end when newspapers at home said it did. Not for men who limped on bad knees from cold Italian mornings and French nights in wet holes. Not for families who waited behind wire to see if a telegram arrived. Not for a country that needed years to believe its new story. Medals gathered in drawers, a drift of ribbons and bronze stars, and the rare circle of sky-blue silk. The regiment's name began to attach to words like most and ever. At reunions, a man would touch the cloth on his blazer and say the weight came from memory, not thread. Later, some of the same men walked into classrooms and told younger faces what it meant to salute, while your mother showed papers at a camp gate. Some became lawyers and judges who read the Constitution with sharp pencils. Some went back to grocery stores that had put up signs during the war and took them down later. Others did not come home at all, and their parents moved photographs to better light and dusted them on Sundays. When the country finally said it was sorry and offered redress, the old soldiers nodded, grateful, and then went back to talking about friends who still did not have birthdays. Ask a man who wore that patch what he remembers, and he will talk about the sound of climbing, boots in mud, gear ticking against gear, a buddy's breath when the hill turned mean. He'll say his greatest pride wasn't the medals, but the way the line never bent the wrong way when it was their turn to hold. He might tell you about the day in the forest when a Texan with a week-old beard grabbed his sleeve and would not let go until he promised to pass a message to a wife whose name he still remembers. When the roll of American units is read, the 442nd sits where it cannot be ignored, small in number, huge in record, a fact stacked high with citations and with names on marble that families touch when they visit. Their story isn't neat. It is a record of people asked to wear 2 kinds of proof at once, a uniform on their backs and patience in their bones. They did the first easily and the second because they had to. The forests and hills they crossed kept their footprints only until the next rain, but the work they did kept its shape. The ridge where the Texans waited is quiet now. Hikers pause where the slope steepens and wonder how anyone chose this way. If the air is still, you can hear the small sounds that never leave a battlefield. Leaves tapping leather, the clink of a sling swivel, the brief instruction passed from man to man. You can imagine a private named Tanaka taking one more step than he thought he had, and trusting the man in front to keep moving until the ridge broke into light. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.